Welcome. You're here because you want to get past the headlines, really understand the full picture. And today, we're doing exactly that with Henry Ford. We're going way beyond the usual story. We're digging into what was really driving him, the engines behind his massive success, and, well, it might surprise you how much of it seems to come down to his deepest fears.
That's absolutely right. We've really dug into a whole range of sources for this. Things like the opening of the River Rouge plant back in 1917, his own book, My Life and Work, detailed analyses of his production
The whole
methods.
concept of Fordism.
Exactly, Fordism as a system,
Mm.
plus biographical details, and yeah, even his really troubling anti-Semitic writings. Our aim here is to look at 7 key stages in his business journey and see how his anxieties at each point weren't just problems, they often acted as, well, fuel. Fuel for both incredible innovation and, frankly, some major missteps.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Late 19th century. Cars are, what, toys for the rich? And Henry Ford's basically a guy tinkering in his garage. He's not the titan yet.
Not at all. He's just starting out, facing all the usual risks. And the material we looked at really highlights, I think, 3 main anxieties for him back then. First, he'd already had 2 businesses fail before he finally got the Ford Motor Company off the ground in 1903.
Right.
So you can imagine there's this real fear of failing again, a fear that maybe this whole car idea just wouldn't work out for him.
That makes sense. That kind of history would weigh on anyone. What else?
Well, second, he relied heavily on partners and investors early on, and that suggests a fear of shouldering all the risks, both financial and operational, completely alone.
Which always means giving up some control, right?
Always. And third, there's his, well, almost obsessive need to keep tinkering, keep refining those early designs. His partners were getting impatient. They wanted a car to sell quickly. But Ford seemed driven by this fear of putting out something that wasn't, absolutely perfect in his eyes.
Okay, so he's got these anxieties. Fear of failure, fear of going it alone, fear of imperfection.
Yeah.
But what good actually came out of that? Did it help somehow?
Yeah, interestingly, it did. Those early failures, they weren't just dead ends. They were like essential learning experiences. He learned so much about mechanics, about what people might actually buy,
Okay.
needing investors. Well, that brought in the cash he absolutely needed for his big plans and that constant drive for improvement. While frustrating for his partners then, it meant the car he did eventually develop was much more reliable. That was crucial for the Model T success later on.
So the setbacks weren't really setbacks, more like R&D. What's the lesson there for entrepreneurs listening now?
I think there are a few key things. One, see failure as part of the process, maybe even necessary learning. Don't be defined by it. Two, partnerships can be vital for resources, but make sure you're aligned on the big picture. And three, yes, strive for quality, definitely. But you've got to find that balance, right, between endless perfecting and actually getting your product out there.
All right, fast forward to 1908, the Model T. It hits the market, it's affordable, it's reliable, it's a phenomenon. Suddenly, Ford's problem isn't finding buyers, it's making enough cars. A whole new set of anxieties, I bet.
Oh, completely different ballgame. The success was massive, almost instantaneous. And that brought this huge fear. What if we can't keep up? What if the orders pile up and we lose this momentum? The sources make it really clear this fear was the driving force behind his push into mass production. The giant factories, standard parts, and of course the moving assembly line.
All driven by the fear of not meeting demand.
Pretty much. Fear of backlogs, fear of competitors catching up simply because he couldn't build cars fast enough. He didn't just want to build more cars. He envisioned this almost machine-like process, identical parts flowing down a line. It was totally radical compared to the skilled craft approach at the time.
We take it for granted now, but yeah, that scale was unheard of.
Mm-hmm.
What else fueled these production changes?
Well, his famous line, any color as long as it's black. That wasn't just about efficiency, though it was that too. It seems rooted in a fear that offering choices would just gum up the works, add complexity he couldn't afford.
Keep it simple to keep it moving.
Exactly. And the obsession with minimizing waste everywhere, that came directly from the pressure of scaling up so fast. He feared costs would spiral out of control if they weren't incredibly efficient. The whole just-in-time idea started here. Don't stockpile tons of parts you don't need right now. It frees up cash and space.
Okay, so fear of unmet demand, fear of complexity, fear of rising costs. What were the upsides of tackling these fears head on?
The results were, well, revolutionary. Mass production slashed the time and cost to build a car dramatically. That made the Model T even more affordable.
Right, creating this virtuous cycle.
Precisely. Standardization made manufacturing easier, sure, but also repairs. Anyone can fix a Model T, pretty much. And yeah, that relentless efficiency drive, it worked. Lower costs meant higher profits, even with those low prices.
It's amazing how a good problem like too much demand can force such huge innovation. What's the takeaway for businesses today that hit that rapid growth phase?
Plan for scale. Think about it before you desperately need it. How will you handle success? Also, really weigh the pros and cons of standardization. Where can you simplify without losing what makes you special? And constantly focus on optimizing processes and cutting waste. It's absolutely vital when you're growing fast.
Okay, so Ford solves the production puzzle.
Yeah.
But that kind of success inevitably attracts attention. Competitors start showing up,
Yeah.
GM, Chrysler. The game changes again.
Yeah, absolutely. And the market starts maturing. Ford isn't the only name anymore. And that brings a whole new wave of anxieties.
Like what? What was he worried about now?
Well, the big one was probably the fear of being overtaken. Losing that dominant position he'd fought so hard for. You see that anxiety playing out in his eventual decision to introduce the Model A in 1927. That was a huge shift for him.
Yeah, after sticking with the Model T for so long, changing must have been tough.
Incredibly tough. His initial resistance to changing the design frequently, that probably stemmed from a fear of messing with a winning formula, maybe a fear of adding complexity back into the system he'd perfected, or maybe just the cost.
But he couldn't ignore the competition forever.
No, and his main defense for a long time was just price. Keep it low, keep the customers. That focus on rock-bottom prices was definitely one way he tried to fight off rivals.
So fear of being outdone, fear of changing the magic formula, and using price as a weapon. Did any good come out of this competitive pressure?
Well, the fact that he did eventually introduce new models, even reluctantly, showed he could adapt when push really came to shove. And his continued focus on efficiency, keeping those prices low, that benefited consumers and kept the whole industry on its toes. Plus, the Model T basically created the mass market for cars. So even with competition, the pie was much, much bigger thanks to him.
Right. Competition spurs innovation and can even grow the market for everyone. What lessons are in there for entrepreneurs dealing with rivals today?
You've got to watch the competition constantly. Be ready to adapt your product, your strategy, find that balance, that tricky balance between sticking to what you do best and innovating where you need to. And make sure your pricing makes sense long term. It needs to reflect value, not just be a race to the bottom, unless that's truly sustainable for you.
Let's shift to the early 1920s. There was a nasty economic recession. Suddenly, even Ford wasn't immune. Financial pressure, rumors the company might be in trouble. That must have hit a nerve.
Oh, definitely. This period really underscores Ford's intense fear of losing control, particularly financial control. He hated debt, hated the idea of bankers telling him what to do. So when things got tight in the early 20s, instead of borrowing money like most companies might have,
What did he do?
he launched this massive internal overhaul in 1921. Ruthless cost cutting across the board, aggressively pushing dealers to buy cars, even forcing inventory on them to generate cash. It was brutal, but it avoided external loans.
Wow, doubling down internally instead of seeking outside help. What else did that financial fear drive?
Well, that push towards just-in-time production we mentioned, it got a huge boost here. Reducing those massive stockpiles of materials and finished cars wasn't just about efficiency anymore. It was about freeing up desperately needed cash tied up in inventory.
Makes sense.
And maybe the biggest move, driven by this fear of external influence, was buying out all his remaining minority shareholders by 1920. He wanted absolute 100% control, no dissenting voices, no partners second-guessing him during a crisis.
So a deep fear of debt, fear of running out of cash, and this overriding fear of losing control. What were the outcomes, maybe the unexpected benefits of acting on those fears?
Well, first and foremost, it arguably saved the company. Those drastic internal measures, including the early JIT stuff, kept Ford afloat without owing money to banks. That was huge. Gaining total ownership meant he could implement his vision, his strategies without any interference. Right or wrong, it was his decision. And that laser focus on slashing waste during the crisis, it led to lasting improvements in how the whole company operated.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? Sometimes a crisis forces you to find efficiencies you wouldn't have otherwise. What can leaders today take from Ford's financial anxieties?
Well, financial prudence is rarely a bad thing. Avoiding excessive debt gives you options. Always be looking at your inventory and supply chain. That's often where cash gets trapped. optimize it. And, think carefully about control. Absolute control might feel safe, but sometimes diverse perspectives from partners or shareholders can be really valuable, especially when things get tough. It's a balance.
Okay, let's talk about Ford and his workers. It's complicated. You've got the famous $5 day, revolutionary for its time. But then you have his intense, even violent opposition to unions. What fears were driving that dynamic?
Yeah, it's deeply contradictory. And again, fear seems central, particularly the fear of losing control over the factory floor, over the workers themselves. Take the sociological department he set up. It wasn't just about helping workers. It involved inspectors visiting homes, checking on their lifestyles, trying to enforce Ford's idea of proper behavior, even trying to Americanize immigrants.
Which sounds incredibly invasive today.
It does, and it suggests a fear of a workforce that didn't fit his rigid mold, a fear they'd be unmanageable or wouldn't share his work ethic if left to their own devices.
And the anti-union stance, that was more than just disagreement, wasn't it?
Oh, much more. It was fierce opposition, using security forces, intimidation, the infamous Battle of the Overpass, where union organizers were brutally beaten. It points to a profound fear of collective bargaining. He seemed to see unions as an existential threat to his authority, to his ability to run his factories his way. He genuinely believed, or at least said he believed, that unions would ruin everything. He feared losing that absolute control over production.
So a fear of nonconformity in the workforce, a deep fear of losing control to organized labor, and just a fundamental distrust of collective action. Were there any, positive outcomes, maybe unintended ones, from this fear-driven approach?
It's tricky territory. But the $5 day, while partly motivated by control and reducing turnover, did significantly stabilize his workforce. Less turnover means more experienced workers, which probably helped efficiency.
Okay.
And undeniably, the sheer scale of his operations created hundreds of thousands of jobs. That transformed Detroit and the whole economy, plus his emphasis on individual responsibility for specific tasks, while maybe harsh, did foster a certain culture of accountability on the line.
A really complex picture. What lessons, maybe cautionary ones, can entrepreneurs take from Ford's anxieties about labor?
While paying competitively clearly helps attract and keep good people. That seems obvious, but it's key. Trying to understand and address employee concerns usually works better long-term than just fighting organization efforts. And ultimately, you have to find a balance. Control is important in a business, yes, but so are fair labor practices and respecting workers' rights. It's about building something sustainable ethically, too.
Now we need to address a really dark and frankly disturbing part of Ford's legacy. His outspoken anti-Semitism, promoted heavily through his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. What fears could possibly underlie such hateful views?
Yeah, this is a deeply troubling aspect, and it's crucial we address it directly. The evidence, particularly his writings, strongly suggests his anti-Semitism was rooted in a kind of paranoid fear. A fear of hidden forces, unseen enemies, manipulating world events, and even undermining his own success.
A conspiracy theory mindset.
Very much so. He published articles blaming Jewish people for all sorts of ills, wars, economic problems, you name it. It points to this deep-seated paranoia, a fear of an imagined enemy, this vast Jewish conspiracy he believed was infecting America.
And using his platform, his newspaper, to spread this.
Yes, the widespread distribution of the Dearborn Independent through his dealerships shows he felt this urgent need, this fear perhaps, that these supposed truths had to be broadcast. He seemed convinced he was fighting some hidden evil and needed everyone to know about it.
It's hard to even conceptualize a benefit here, but purely from the perspective of understanding his motivation, however twisted, what might he have perceived he was gaining?
From that very specific analytical viewpoint and acknowledging how harmful this was, maybe it strengthened his bond with people who already held those prejudices. It gave him a direct, unfiltered channel to spread his views and influence a segment of the public. And perhaps, in his own distorted way, focusing on this imagined enemy gave him a perverse sense of purpose, a feeling he was fighting for something important, however wrong and damaging that fight truly was.
It's a chilling example of how prejudice and fear can combine with power. What are the absolute critical lessons here for leaders, for anyone, really?
Right.
Vigilance against your own biases is paramount. Prejudice clouds judgment and leads to terrible actions with real-world harm. That's lesson 1. Lesson 2. Ethical leadership requires inclusivity. Treating everyone with respect, regardless of background or belief, is non-negotiable. And lesson 3. If you have a platform, any influence at all, you have a massive responsibility to use it for good, for promoting understanding, not for spreading hate or misinformation.
Moving towards the end of his life, Ford's impact was undeniable. But even then, as he looked back and maybe ahead, What anxieties lingered about his legacy?
Even in his later years, the sources suggest he still harbored this fear, this anxiety, that his life's work could be mismanaged, that the company might drift away from the principles he established. You see it in his reluctance to truly let go of the reins, right? Even after making his son Edsel president, Henry often kept the real authority.
Still afraid of losing control, even then.
It seems so. And his big projects like Greenfield Village and the Edison Institute Museum, you could see those as attempts to sort of solidify his version of American history, his values. Maybe a fear that those things were being lost in a changing world. His quote, "The farther you look back, the farther you can look ahead," might show a fear of losing touch with what he saw as the bedrock principles of his own success.
Wanting to lock in his vision, his interpretation of the past. Did anything positive come from these later life anxieties?
Well, his continued, if sometimes meddling involvement, did keep his original vision alive within the company for longer. And those museums and historical projects, whatever the motivation, have become genuinely valuable educational resources. That's a lasting positive contribution. And maybe, just maybe, his deep dive into the past did give him some unique perspectives on future challenges, even if his approach became a bit rigid.
So, right to the end, fear was still shaping his actions. What final lessons can entrepreneurs draw from Ford's anxieties about legacy?
Plan for succession. Seriously, it's crucial. Learn to delegate, trust others to carry things forward. Preserving company history and values is good. It builds identity. But don't let it trap you. Don't let it block essential change and adaptation. And yeah, learn from the past, absolutely. But don't let it blind you to the future or stop you from innovating.
Wow. So Henry Ford's story, it's so much more than just the assembly line, isn't it? It's this incredible mix of ambition, innovation, and as we've really unpacked today, this powerful, often hidden current of anxiety.
Absolutely. Understanding those fears, fear of failure, fear of losing control, fear of competition, fear of hidden enemies, it gives you such a richer, more human picture of why he made the choices he did, both the brilliant ones and the deeply problematic ones.
And for everyone listening, thinking about business or leadership, Ford's journey really highlights the challenges, right? Managing growth, dealing with rivals, and the absolute necessity of ethical leadership. These aren't just historical footnotes, they're ongoing challenges.
They really are. And looking at how Ford's anxieties fueled both innovation and negative actions, it's quite powerful.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? How much do our own fears, the ones we know about, and maybe the ones we don't, shape our decisions? Drive us forward, maybe hold us back, or even worryingly lead us down paths we shouldn't take. In business, in life.
That's a deep question, definitely something to chew on.
Yeah. And if any particular part of Ford's story sparked your interest today, his financial tactics, the labor issues, anything else, we hope this deep dive encourages you to keep exploring. There's always more to uncover. Welcome. You're here because you want to get past the headlines, really understand the full picture. And today, we're doing exactly that with Henry Ford. We're going way beyond the usual story. We're digging into what was really driving him, the engines behind his massive success, and, well, it might surprise you how much of it seems to come down to his deepest fears.
That's absolutely right. We've really dug into a whole range of sources for this. Things like the opening of the River Rouge plant back in 1917, his own book, My Life and Work, detailed analyses of his production methods.
The whole concept of Fordism.
Exactly, Fordism as a system, plus biographical details, and yeah, even his really troubling anti-Semitic writings. Our aim here is to look at 7 key stages in his business journey and see how his anxieties at each point weren't just problems, they often acted as, well, fuel. Fuel for both incredible innovation and, frankly, some major missteps.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Late 19th century. Cars are, what, toys for the rich? And Henry Ford's basically a guy tinkering in his garage. He's not the titan yet.
Not at all. He's just starting out, facing all the usual risks. And the material we've looked at really highlights, I think, 3 main anxieties for him back then. First, he'd already had 2 businesses fail before he finally got the Ford Motor Company off the ground in 1903.
Right.
So you can imagine there's this real fear of failing again, a fear that maybe this whole car idea just wouldn't work out for him.
That makes sense. That kind of history would weigh on anyone. What else?
Well, second, he relied heavily on partners and investors early on, and that suggests a fear of shouldering all the risks, both financial and operational, completely alone.
Which always means giving up some control, right?
Always. And third, there's his, well, almost obsessive need to keep tinkering, keep refining those early designs. His partners were getting impatient. They wanted a car to sell quickly. But Ford seemed driven by this fear of putting out something that wasn't, absolutely perfect in his eyes.
Okay, so he's got these anxieties. Fear of failure, fear of going it alone, fear of imperfection.